So I'm Harvey Mansfield, and my wife is Anna, sitting right here in front. And got Andy Zwick, our executive director. And we're going to hold a debate between two economists. Edward Conard, on my right, that works politically.
Who doesn't call himself an economist, but that's okay.
And Jason Furman.
Who does?
On my left.
Who is?
So let's, Edward Conard is a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. He's a founding member of Bain Capital. He's written 2 best-selling books, The Upside of Inequality. There you get the idea right away from the title. How Good Intentions Undermine the Middle Class. That came out in 2016, and he's got another one earlier, Unintended Consequences. So he's got a theme. And he writes and publishes widely. He wrote a recent article in the Wall Street Journal called Without Spending Cuts, Brace for Slow Growth.
A title that's chosen by the Wall Street Journal, not by me, but...
Yes, all right. And he graduated from the University of Michigan with a BS, Bachelor of Science, and an MBA from the Harvard Business School. That's Edward Conard. Now, Jason Furman is a liberal, somewhat on the left, calls himself, or is called without his complaint, Democrat. He's got a joint appointment.
Better than autocrat.
Please.
So he's got a joint appointment as professor of economics in the Harvard Kennedy School and also in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences in the Department of Economics. He's a political or politic economist. He was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors and a member of the cabinet in the 2 terms of President Barack Obama, White House. And he teaches Ec 10, Economics, Introduction to Economics, to hundreds of students at Harvard, where he's well known and much praised. And he also writes for the Wall Street Journal, and he's written a recent article called Left and Right Alike Are Blind on Trade-Offs. Actually was the talk that he gave to us in our program last year. He's a graduate of Harvard as an undergraduate and a Ph.D. in economics, not government, where he started.
I have an MA in government.
An MA in government. Wow, how impressive. So, Ed Conard is going to...
Here's a quick question, which is, does anybody in the room spend a substantial share of their income buying lottery tickets? I didn't think so. In part, I'm here today because of Jason's talk last year, in which he argued that liberals get the sign wrong and the effect of their policy, while conservatives get the order of magnitude wrong. And after the talk, I asked Harvey, is heading in the right direction, but not getting as far as you expected, better than heading in the wrong direction? And he asked me to come and debate Jason, so I came today. I thought this graphic would put our debate in perspective. This shows you the number of billion-dollar companies created over the last 50 years, publicly held companies, in the United States versus Europe. It's about 70 times greater in the United States than it is in Europe. And that is despite the fact that Europe and the European Union has the same population and education levels as the United States. It's obvious why these companies arise in America but not elsewhere. Working at companies like Apple, which is worth more than the 30 largest German companies combined, exposes workers to valuable insights that they wouldn't be able to get if they were working at firms like BMW. And that increases the expected value of the payoffs of entrepreneurial risk-taking, so no surprise. With much higher expected returns, talented Americans take a lot more risk. And even if America's success stems from happenstance, because we enjoy economies of scale, we speak English, we spend more on defense, our good fortune nevertheless increases the returns that spur increased risk-taking, and this has had a large and compounding effect on America's success that we don't find in other high-wage economies. I didn't show you Japan, but it's even smaller. Perhaps it's just a matter of time before innovation occurs, but occurring here first in America and not elsewhere has proven to be enormously valuable for Americans. The growth that successful risk-taking has spurred has not only created tens of millions of jobs for immigrants and offshore workers, twice the employment growth of Europe, but it's also raised wages relative to Europe. According to the OECD, the disposable income of the median American household, properly adjusted for healthcare and other government services, was 20% richer than Germany 25 years ago, and is now 25% richer, despite Americans having lower academic test scores. A third of Americans score at the lowest levels on academic tests. America has about twice as many low scores per capita as Northern Europe, and half as many high scores. That gives our low scorers 75% less supervision from high scores than their European counterparts, and still they earn more. A comparable scoring American earns about 50% more than a European, a Western European. And Europe would be poor still if it wasn't free riding on America's enormous contribution of innovation, which you can see here, as well as our defense spending and our healthcare profits. And so regardless of the reasons for America's higher returns, tax rates bear directly on expected returns. A 50% tax rate cuts America's expected return in half. And unless sophisticated risk takers are irrational, unlike the people in this room who don't invest in lottery tickets, having the expected returns will more than half the risk taking. And so the notion that tax elasticities can be measured by small changes in the hours worked by talented people who are already working long hours, as Jason claimed the last time he was here, and not by changes in the risks they're willing to take and the arduous careers that they're willing to pursue, misses the forest for the trees. It's no wonder that Jason thinks conservatives overestimate tax elasticities, even though the difference in results, shown here, indicates that the long-term elasticities are grossly underestimated by measures of hours worked. And given the utter failure of Europe and Japan to produce innovation, we should take returns high enough to, we should not take returns high enough to spur increased risk-taking for granted, especially when capital returns overall have been mediocre and entrepreneurs face enormous unsystematic risks that diversified investors can avoid. Now, it's true that people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs took risk without expecting to earn the enormous fortunes that they earned. But it's also true that the oversized tail of the distribution produces what is essential to producing what are at best mediocre venture capital returns, and that unlike other high-wage economies, armies of American risk takers followed in their wake, hoping to duplicate their windfalls, and this allowed America's success to bubble up from a much larger but hidden pool of failure. Now, William Nordhaus, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, estimates that innovators capture only a fraction of the value that they create. The customers, the computer users, for example, capture the vast majority of the value. So unlike Europe, which doesn't have many worthy ideas worth taking risks, it's extremely expensive for America not to maximize the social welfare that's created by innovation. Let's go back to the lottery. A $3 lottery ticket has a 1 in 300 million chance of hitting the jackpot. So it makes no sense to buy a lottery ticket until the jackpot reaches $900 million. That's $3 times 300 million. Because it pays out over your lifetime, it doesn't reach a positive expected return until it reaches $1.5 billion. A tax structure that valued that risk-taking properly would only tax the gains greater than $1.5 billion, since the expected value of buying a lottery ticket is uneconomical until the payoff exceeds that amount. Up until that point, it doesn't make any sense to buy it. taxing the first dollar instead of the 1.5 billionth dollar makes it uneconomical to buy a lottery ticket until the payoff exceeds $3 billion. And it's self-defeating to raise the bar that high ex ante. So for many logical but risky investments that society should want businesses and entrepreneurs to make, for example, taking a 1 in 20 chance to get a 30 times payoff, the economic tax ratio is more than 100% on that investment. You lose money at a 30% tax rate. Is it any surprise that underestimating the tax elasticities by mistakenly measuring changes in hours worked has led to aggressive social spending increases in the face of unprecedented increases in debt relative to GDP following the pandemic and the financial crisis? Also doing it in the face of retiring baby boomers who are on the cusp of eating us alive. Doing it in the face of a growing Chinese military threat where the cost of partially decoupling our economies are going to be quite great. In the face of looming costs to mitigate global warming, and in the face of slow population growth to pay for it all. Democrats drove ongoing federal spending from 19% of GDP before the financial crisis to nearly 24% today. In the face of these increases, Republicans foolishly swapped tax cuts, temporary tax cuts, for permanent spending increases. If you increase the consumption, eventually someone has to pay for it, whether with higher taxes, less investment, inflation, greater interest payments, or fewer government services. Now, propagandists often blame these things for slower growth. But let's not kid ourselves. Ultimately, increased consumption slows growth, not the different ways that you pay for it. The cancerous political strategy of demanding more spending, no matter how much more, has driven real ongoing per capita spending up 55% since the financial crisis and 25% since the pandemic, more than double the growth rate in real GDP per capita. I'm so astonished by those numbers, by the way, that every time I read my piece, I have to go back and check the numbers because I don't believe them when I read it. A 55% increase in per capita spending from the government over that time, twice the rate in which the economy grew. And you can see that because when you go from 17 to 24, that's about a 25% increase, 30%. And when you go, 19 before the financial crisis to 23.5 today, that's about a 25% increase. And the economy's grown a couple percent a year for the last 7 to 18 years. That would be about a 25% increase in GDP. So the two combined to create the numbers. But I tell you, it was so astonishing, I couldn't believe it. And federal spending since 2019 now consumes half of the increase in GDP since then. So since 2019, we've spent half of the increase in GDP. Debt has risen from 35% of GDP prior to the financial crisis to 100% today with no end in sight, even if you use the CBO's far-fetched forecast, which recklessly assumes no budget-busting recessions. To put it in perspective, with spending nearing 24% of GDP and taxes at 17%, we need a 35% across-the-board tax increase to balance the budget. And balancing the budget barely gets you back into equilibrium. With 4% nominal growth, which is what the CBO forecasts, if we stave off a budget-busting recession for 10 years, which seems unlikely, a recession will leave us right back in the precarious fiscal position that we're in right now. So you have to be driving down debt relative to GDP if you want to hold it constant at the levels that we're at. And we're not doing that. A 20% tax increase combined with a 25% across-the-board per capita spending cut that excludes Social Security and Medicare and defense, but we can put it in or not put it in, which merely returns us to the rest of spending to pre-pandemic levels, 2019 levels, would produce the same result. It would hold us in equilibrium if we could hold off a recession for 10 years, which is unlikely. Both of them are extremely unlikely, both scenarios. No one's going to do it. And a shock would likely send us into the shock of trying to do it would likely send us into a recession. But whether you inflict the costs all at once or you boil the frog slowly, the cost of all these spending increases are still enormous. And they may sound draconian, but you probably underestimate the amount of spending. If we gave the $1.6 trillion we're currently spending on Medicaid and welfare to the poorest 20% of households, it would total nearly $90,000 a year, more than the $80,000 a year median household income. And that doesn't include the money we're spending on education, and nor does it include the $2.3 trillion we're spending on people over the age of 65. And that may sound hard to believe, and some of that spending is buying middle-class votes. It's not helping the poor. But there's a recent study by the Atlanta Fed, which I want to show you. That's what these boards are for. Okay. This is the Atlanta Fed, so, no dog in the hunt here. A single mother, this is on the left versus the right, single mother on the left, with a 3-year-old child earning $11,000 a year in Washington, D.C., receives about $68,000 of government benefits, and this gives her more income than if she earned $65,000 a year, which is substantially more than the median wage of $52,000 at the time. Now, that includes pre-K, but you might note that we're spending $17,000 on pre-K, but the woman's only working for $11,000, which means she's working a couple hours a week, and then we're giving her childcare on top of it. So it's not as though we're giving her childcare so that she can work. But it makes no sense to take this woman who's earning $11,000 and give her more money than a woman who's out there in the marketplace earning $65,000, which is not to say that we shouldn't be helping the poor and that we shouldn't be helping children. It's just that we've taken it to extremes. The level of spending isn't fulfilling our moral obligation to the poor. Okay, it's vote buying graft. It's just one of democracy's biggest weaknesses. Okay, and it preys on the naivete of the voters and their feelings of sympathy and guilt. If we were to return 2019 back to 2019 per capita spending levels, this would cut about $8,000 from her benefits, which doesn't look unreasonable given the size of the benefits that we're paying her. Why aren't the voters up in arms? First of all, they don't understand the magnitude of the spending. And why don't they understand the magnitude of the spending? Because they haven't felt the consequences, because the flood of offshore savings that's lent to us at near zero interest rates via the trade deficit has allowed policymakers to raise spending and cut taxes without immediate political or financial consequences, but only as long as the interest rate remains near zero. And the interest rate has risen as the Biden administration has gorged itself on spending and devoured savings at an astonishing rate of 6.5% of GDP. Gross investment's only 17% of GDP. These foolish fiscal policies have addicted voters to government spending without the pain of taxation and recklessly made us dependent on offshore savings funded by trade deficits. Policymakers did this to us knowing that voters elect politicians not to solve problems, but to stick somebody else with their bill, and would therefore blame not the reckless policies that created this mess, but whoever earnestly tried to solve the problem by cutting taxes, cutting spending, or raising taxes. And so without enough votes to cut spending or taxes enough to matter, and we'll see, but I doubt it, the problem is nearly impossible to solve without a crisis. And policymakers knew this and they did it anyway. So what's the difference between Jason and I? I say respect and caution for putting America's success at risk is the difference between a traditional conservative like me and those who spent aggressively after debt hit historical highs following the last two recessions, the last two shocks to our economy, and they've charged forward and continued spending anyway. And here we are today, and I believe that we have a problem which is virtually unsolvable without a crisis. So I turn to Jason and say, Jason, where am I wrong? Where did I get it wrong? How did this happen? Why did policymakers let this happen?
So I'm in the slightly awkward position of agreeing with a certain amount of what you said. For example, I was very critical of overspending during the Biden administration and the problems that's caused, but let's not dwell on our agreements. Google, California, Meta, California, Apple, California, Microsoft and Amazon, Washington, NVIDIA, I think it's California.
I'm glad you're going to make this argument.
If I were called on to advise a country or a state, and I had two choices of what types of policies they could have. Option A, you have high taxes, you have all sorts of stupid regulations that make it hard to start a business, and you have a great university. Option B, low taxes, really easy to start a business, and you don't have any university at all, I would choose option A. Now, to be clear, there's an option C, which is even better than A or B, but I would choose option A. California and this area of the country are two of the most prosperous places on the entire planet Earth, in the entire history of the planet Earth, when there's a lot of other states in our country that have lower taxes and are friendlier to businesses. The reason for that is tech, Silicon Valley there, robotics, pharmaceuticals, artificial intelligence here. That innovation comes quite a lot out of that. I should say as a side thing, I think that's relevant for certain debates that are going on about our largest universities in our country right now, and maybe should be taken into account. So why do taxes maybe not matter as much as Ed thinks? Spending might not be as problematic as Ed thinks. And I have to say, by the way, I was a little bit confused because like half of Ed's talk was how amazing America is, and the other half is how awful America is. But somehow these companies not only grew, but they're continuing to grow. And that's the last 50 years. You could say, oh, it was all great 40 years ago. But in the last decade, OpenAI, Anthropic, basically NVIDIA exploding to what it is today. So we're continuing to see a very steady pipeline of these new, incredibly successful 10 billion and more companies despite this. So why do the taxes and spending maybe matter somewhat less than what Ed said? On the tax side, our tax rates actually have been at the high end the same or higher than what they are in Europe. We've had this view in the two parties. Republicans, when they come into office, cut taxes for 100% of people. Democrats come in and say the Republicans were horrible, terrible, can't do anything like that. We're going to only cut taxes for 99% of people, and we're going to raise them on 1%. And so every time there's a president, the taxes on the bottom 99% go down, whether they're Democrat or Republican, and then they alternate. And on balance have gone up. Democrats have been better at raising them on the rich than Republicans have been on cutting them, in part because Democrats got a little bit of a help from the first George W. Bush, who did that as well in 1990. So we have a tax system in the United States that's actually higher tax rates at the high end than it is in Europe, and yet we still have all these companies. So why is that? Part of that is that a lot of stuff isn't taxed, especially a lot of capital income isn't taxed. It's in retirement accounts, it's in foundations. At least as of now, the $52 billion that Harvard has goes into all sorts of innovative investments. That is not taxed. Some people want to change that. And moreover, capital gains. If you make an investment, you don't pay taxes until you sell it. There's a number of provisions that if it's related to startup or innovative investment, maybe you don't have to pay capital gains at all. There's ways in which you can use depreciation allowances, deduct interest on debt, shift income overseas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that isn't, by the way, the ideal way to design a tax system. I would rather not have 12 different self-help ways to lower your taxes, combined with a high official rate, but instead would rather have a low official rate and you couldn't really get out of it. So I'd broaden the base, lower the rate, and be happy to talk about the details of how to do that later. But we're not in quite the hellscape that
I did not lay a hellscape out. I said our fiscal policy is messed up.
So let's now go to our fiscal policy. And part of this picture here on the right gets at an issue that I was trying to get at in my talk last year, which is growth matters quite a lot. GDP matters quite a lot. GDP is really correlated with everything that we care about. Child mortality, life expectancy, happiness, health, all of that gets better when GDP goes up. But GDP isn't the ultimate goal. We ultimately do care about things like living standards. We care about poverty. Some people care about inequality for its own sake. Other people don't. National security. Some people care about national identity. Maybe they like diversity and multiculturalism. Maybe they don't and want to keep the country sort of looking the same as what it has. All of these are other values that you might have outside of growth. And so quantifying how far you get, you said, Ed, you think you're going, you didn't put numbers on it. You think you're going 10 miles, you only go 1 mile. Well, at least you made progress. Why would you be against that? Well, if you only are measuring on one goal, then 1 mile is better than no miles. But if you're doing 2 goals and you have trade-offs, then you start to care. So where might we have trade-offs? If people saved more, we'd have more in the future, but we'd also have lower living standards today because consumption would be lower today. Now, I'm not saying we should or shouldn't save more, but you need to sort of solve for that, not just assert that it's better. I think some of these welfare policies that we see here are a trade-off. You get less work today, but you also get a higher living standard and better for children. And that brings me to the next part, that it's not just that we care about a variety of things, and I personally would be willing to give up a little bit of growth to have less poverty. I wouldn't give up a lot of growth. Ultimately, growth helps lift people out of poverty, but if your plan is to take away $40,000 from people in benefits they're getting, you need a lot of growth to make up for that in a way that is implausible. So you need to take those trade-offs into account. There aren't easy answers. In some places, and Ed wrote a terrific book on Upside of Inequality, which I read. Haven't read your other book, Ed, but I will at some point. But Upside of Inequality, there's a lot of ways in which inequality, I think, actually is good. It motivates people. It generates capital in terms of the people with a lot of wealth that they can rechannel into other things, and all of that benefits everyone. But there's other ways that it's bad, including being bad for growth. One of those ways is when it comes to an equality that most of us actually think should be true, but really isn't right now, which is equality of opportunity. And you look at innovation. You can measure innovation by how many patents you file. My colleague here, Raj Chetty, has done research where he looks at people's parents' income and then matches that to how many patents they file. And the graph that relates those two is incredibly steep. People whose parents were in the bottom 80% of the income distribution barely file any patents. By the time you get to the 90 or 95th, it starts to get quite steep. By the time you get to the top 0.1% of parental income, those children are filing a lot of patents. Those patents are what made these companies. A lot of their things weren't patented, but they're correlated with the same types of innovations that made these companies. And so why is it so related to income? Part of it is genetics. Talented parents make more money and have children that are more talented. But an awful lot of it is not genetics. It is the way we finance schools in the United States, where it's the local area pays for the schools. So rich areas have good schools, poor areas have bad schools.
Not true.
It's the enrichment that you get outside of, you have your chance.
Okay.
It's the enrichment you get
putting
outside of
markers.
schools in terms of affording tutors, summer school. There's a lot of learning loss that happens over the summer. That happens more for poorer children than richer children. Parental inputs matter too. But if anything, that says you want to overcompensate and do more to provide non-parental inputs. So we are, and this is in Raj's terminology, missing a lot of Einsteins. Just to be clear, there are places where we give money to people where they are lifted out of poverty at the expense of economic growth. In some cases, that's bad if it's at the expense of a lot of growth. In some cases, it's good if it's a little growth. But there are also places where we fail to lift people out of poverty and we lose out on economic growth as a result because of these missing Einsteins. And so moving towards a society that has more equality of opportunity is important. And I should say equality of opportunity doesn't just require more money. In some cases, you could do it for less but run things better. So K through 12 schools, for example, I actually don't think that on aggregate they're underfunded. I think on aggregate, though, things like teachers' unions have gotten in the way of making teachers accountable, firing teachers that are bad, and having the types of great teachers that can be for children. So this is not just a plea for more money. This is a plea for thinking more broadly. So now let's talk about our fiscal situation. I very much agree that we are in an unsustainable place. I very much agree that we are in a problematic place. I think I'm just a little bit less worried than Ed is on how imminent the problem is and how large a magnitude it will be and what the cost of delaying solving it are. That being said, I don't think it's a huge disagreement, and I'd much, much rather not take our chances on it. So what are the underlying sources? I think here Ed and I disagree. First of all, the spending number you heard includes interest on the debt. Why do we have a debt today? We have a debt today because spending has historically been higher than taxes. And so if you have a tax cut, that will increase interest on the debt. If you have a spending increase, that will increase interest on the debt. So that piece of it I'd almost pull out and call it sort of neutral. It doesn't really count as spending or taxes because
Unfortunately,
it was
we
caused.
can't, but keep going.
Well, you can. It's
We
called
can
primary
theori-
spending.
We can theoretically get a theoretical ladder, but we do have to live with the interest that we accrue.
Oh,
Go on.
no. Oh, no. Obviously, we're not going to not pay our interest. I'm just saying in understanding and diagnosing the cause of it, I would call interest a function of past tax cuts and past spending increases. I call spending. The next thing I'd note is whatever you thought spending should be 30 years ago, you should think it's higher, should be higher today. Now, to be clear, you might have thought it should be 10% of GDP then, and that it should be 15% now. So you could still think it's too high. You're allowed to think that. But let's try to understand why, whatever you thought before, spending should be higher now. There's several reasons. One is some of the things the government does are things that are more labor intensive. They're subject to something called Baumal's disease. Health and education are naturally going to rise in relative cost. The government doesn't provide flat screen TVs for people. Those are, borderline free at this point in time. The second thing is there's a higher share of elderly. With a higher share of elderly, even the same amount of money for each one of them will cost more, and a society would want to spend more and would want to prepare in advance for that in the way that we did a little bit, but not nearly enough. A third thing is there's more inequality today than there was 30 years ago, and if you think there's any role for government redistribution, there should be more redistribution now than there was before. And finally, looking forward, I think the global defense situation has gotten much more serious and much more complicated, and defense spending probably needs to rise. What does that all leave me with? A little bit less urgency about solving our fiscal problem than Ed. But the way I'd solve it would be different both economically and politically. Economically, I would solve it with a combination of tax increases and spending cuts. Going back to what I said at the beginning, if those tax increases were done in a smart way, so for example, with business taxes, you allowed unlimited depreciation, you limited interest deductions, you could then collect more revenue and do it in a way that distorts decisions less. And I'm happy to explain more of that, but just if you want to call it broaden the base and lower the rate. So I'd raise revenue, ideally with tax reform, not just blunt, stupid ways of randomly increases it. And then I'd cut spending. I would primarily exempt the poor from those spending cuts. That was something the Bowles-Simpson Fiscal Commission about a decade ago had as one of its basic principles.
When the spending
and
was
a
much
number of
smaller.
Republicans at the time were very, very supportive and enthusiastic about it. Its recommendations did not become law. It mostly exempt low income. That isn't to say you wouldn't reform and deliver that low income stuff better. I have all sorts of ideas for that. But Social Security, especially for, say, the top third of beneficiaries, Medicare, which is a health program for the elderly, could be reformed, spend a lot less. Happy to talk about ideas on that and put other constraints on the spending side. What I just said was partly economics, but it was also partly a political theory. When Republicans have been in charge, they have not done any net deficit reduction since the year 1990, precisely the opposite. There was unified Republican control of everything in the year 2005, and they passed something called the Deficit Reduction Act of 2005, and basically cut spending by like billions of dollars. Billions being like Austin Powers, like you smirk because it's so tiny. Now look at this year. Congress passed a budget resolution. Basically, almost every Republican in both chambers voted for it. This sets instructions for what to do. And that's a budget resolution that would raise the debt by $7 trillion over the next decade, while requiring gross spending cuts, not net, because there's a number of spending increases, gross spending cuts of $4 billion. Republicans can't do this on their own. Democrats have been a little bit more successful at deficit reduction if you go back to the primordial past, like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. Joe Biden was not. At doing it party line on their own than Republicans have been, but haven't been as successful as was needed. So ultimately, we're going to need to do this on a bipartisan basis because every way of dealing with it is quite politically unpopular. And so neither side will be able to blame the other because they'll both be holding the knife. So I'll summarize by saying we're a great country because of education. Our taxes are not nearly as important as Ed thinks, but I'm happy to be smarter about them as long as we can also increase them. Opportunity matters both for its own sake, because we care about the well-being of people, and because we need everyone in our country to be innovators. And to solve this, we're going to need to put everything on the table and do it in a bipartisan manner. So vote for me.
I would say I believe that Jason's moderate tone underlies the extremity of the math. So as long as you don't put the math to the numbers, it all sounds reasonable. And when you say things like, we should help the poor, you have to say we're already helping the poor. We're helping them a great deal. Should it be more or should it be less? And how much less should it be given the levels that we're at? I think if you went back, for example, just per capita spending, we all agree that it should go up. Do we agree that it should go up from 2007, say Medicare and income security went from $3,000 to $4,700 and $500? That's a pretty substantial increase. I do the number in my head, but it's more than 50%. And so do we think it should go up? Yeah. Do we think it should go up 55%? That's where the reasonableness of the tone is disconnected to the unreasonableness of the results that have occurred. And so you get lulled into the tone and you get lulled into the argument and you think, oh, we're being pretty reasonable and things haven't fallen apart. But why haven't things been as bad as we think they are? Because we've been borrowing money at zero interest rates, so you haven't been feeling the effect of the policies, the increases in spending. And I would certainly agree with this, that Republicans haven't done their part at all. I'm not here to defend them either, okay? But what matters at the end of the day is how much you spend, not how much you tax. The way you tax matters. And I think Jason and I will agree a lot about the way in which you tax, broaden the base, lower the marginal rates, et cetera. Okay? But that's secondary compared to spending the money. And that what's happened over this period is we're up 55% since 2007. And with debt at 100% of GDP, Democrats cranked up spending another 25%. That's included in my 55. So up 30 and then up another 25 after we were at 100% of debt. And we're at 100% of debt with zero interest rates and very low tax rates. And then the question becomes, should we, at the margin, what should we do? And it's easy to say, oh, at the margin, I'd cut spending, but my party's fighting it tooth and nail. I mean, this morning, I think I read Marco Rubio tried to cut a couple hundred people out of the State Department. The State Department had 30,000 people in it in 2000. Today it has 80,000 people in it. The world's gotten complicated. Has it gotten that much more complicated? I don't know. But if he goes out and tries to cut 300, 400 people, you're going to hear all over the media how unreasonable it is to cut any spending. So I don't think the nature of the problem is this. It's not that, oh, mathematically going forward in the future, we could cut some spending, raise some taxes, and it wouldn't be a problem. It's that why did anybody allow this to happen in the first place, knowing full well that we would find it almost impossible to cut any spending or raise any taxes? Believe me, I was in the Wall Street Journal after the Republican tax cut in 2017 saying, don't cut middle class taxes, because you're never going to be able to raise them again. And you're already at a point where you're giving the middle class about slightly more, depends on how you count it, but more government services than they're paying in taxes. And if you go down that path, what you're going to have people saying is, I'm going to vote for more spending because I don't have to pay for it. I'm getting more than I'm paying, so why wouldn't I vote for more? And if you tilt that balance, okay, you're going to end up where we are. And so it's easy to say, hey, let's be reasonable, but you say, okay, how about this? A 35% across the board, or whatever I calculated, 35% across the board tax increase. Well, geez, I think you'd all be falling out of your chairs if we did that. And you'd hear all over the paper how it's going to destroy growth and how we're going to go into a recession, yet we've already spent the money. And nobody complained a whit about it. And why didn't they complain? Because we borrowed the money at 0 interest rates. And so the way the government works, and I'll put Republicans and Democrats in this, whatever, they're like locusts. Whatever they can spend, whatever they can consume, and it's not investment. Okay, we can talk about how education is investment, and yet the test scores haven't gone up a whit, okay? Not a point. And oh, by the way, as soon as we get to COVID, the teachers union shut down the school and drive the test scores down. So when we talk about all the investment that's occurring, it's basically all consumption. The consumption's out of control, and the guys who are in charge of it are like locusts. So they do the following. They say, I'm the representative of the municipal labor union here in New York City. You want a pay increase? I can't get elected if I give you one, so I'll give you a huge increase in your pension. And therefore, it'll get foisted onto the children who don't vote, and nobody will notice it today. And I can give you whatever you want, as long as I tax somebody who's not going to be here to be represented and complain. And as soon as they drive that up to the gagging point, along comes foreign workers who are economies that are running enormous savings relative to investment and would suffer paradoxes of thrifts if they didn't have outlets for their goods. And the Democrats say, let's start borrowing all of that production. Let's drive the deficits up higher with spending, and I'll get to the Republicans in a second. The interest rate on that is 0. So I'm able to borrow goods. I'm able to give them to people to consume. They're going to vote for me because they're going to be happy. But I don't have to worry about what's going to happen when we have to pay it back, what's going to happen when the interest rate rises, because I won't be in office. Somebody will also be in office. And then we can have a moderate tone about, well, we'll increase spending a little bit, cut spending a little bit, and we'll raise taxes a little bit, as long as you don't understand the magnitude of what is required to bring it into equilibrium. And one of the ways that you avoid that is that you get a CBO to tell you that you're never going to have a recession again. Go take a look at their forecast, okay? It's true that they wind down the growth rate a little bit to average, but we know that in the last 2 recessions over the last 17 years, debt went from 35% of GDP to 100% of GDP. So 65% over 17 years, I don't know, do the math. But if you're not reducing debt by that amount, then you're not fluctuating at a point that's in equilibrium. So they'll say, I can use the CBO forecast that doesn't have any budget busting recessions in it. And if I do this level of spending and deficits, I can hold the debt at 100% of GDP. Jason's publicly saying this. You can read it. I'll go get you the stuff. And we can hold it all in equilibrium at that level. Sure, if we don't have another recession. And if everybody expects to suffer the pain of that recession when the next one comes, because we can't necessarily drive the taxes to 125% or 130% of GDP. And I can say, hey, if the interest rate stays at 0, you can drive the debt anywhere you want. But if the interest rate goes to 4.5%, where it's at long-term 10-year, which is what matters for investment, or 5% if we go there, okay, you're going to find out that going to 130 has real economic consequences that you in this room have not considered. And that Jason, with his calculator, has done the math and puts forward the spending anyway, knowing full well that the Democrats are not going to unwind this, and neither are the Republicans. The Republicans are going to they cut taxes, and I say this, they foolishly cut taxes. They've held taxes at about 17% of GDP, the historical 50-year norm, okay? But those are only temporary. Because as long as you spend the money, you have to get the taxes. There's no free lunch. So those taxes are coming, and whether they're coming as taxes, inflation, higher interest rates, less investment, slower growth, it doesn't matter. You have to make the payments. And so you should run those calculations, and you should say, what happens if I have a 5% interest rate, which, by the way, is not a very high interest rate. Okay, we're just living in a period where it's been 0% for the last 15 years. and you can spend anything you want. Put 5% in your model, assume that we bump into a recession in 5 years, and then assume we bump into a recession every 10 years, and see what you think equilibrium looks like. So he can have a modest tone that says, yeah, I agree, we're not quite in equilibrium, it's not sustainable, but it doesn't reveal how far out of equilibrium we are and how much change we need to get it to a sustainable level, which is a historically high level. So we used to be at 35% of GDP. After the Obama administration, we were at 75% of GDP. We're at 100% of GDP. I'm only trying to hold it in this range where we're at 100 after recession. I mean, I figure, 100, I'm trying to leave it at like a 67% range. So 2/3 of GDP, which is still higher than we've ever had historically. Now, the other thing I would just say, if you had a lot of things in what you said, I would talk two other things. Rich kids. I have a rich kid, okay? She goes to the University of Chicago, just graduated, okay? I don't know about you guys, but she worked every waking moment of her life, okay? On school, on getting grades, on getting high tests, on being the president of the student council, on being the president of her sorority, on building up the credentials that she would need to be competitive in this economy. That is exactly what you want from her, okay? She is enslaved. She is working her ass off. She is one of the most talented people, and you are sucking every ounce of work out of her. The only thing that we haven't gotten yet, and she did an app, if you say it'll buzz you on your wrist because I have enough money to be able to finance it. But the only thing you haven't gotten out of her is putting her career at risk. And that is the real binding constraint to growth. How do you get talented people in this room to put their lawyer career, where they could be making $500,000 a year for the rest of their life, at risk and potentially make nothing? And they go do the calculation and they say, right now on our current tax rate with a 1/3 tax rate, if I have a 1 in 20 chance of making 30 times my money, it is economically illogical for me to do that because the tax rate is more than 100% because I'm taxed on the first dollar and not the incremental dollar over and above my expected return. So what matters here is not this. It's the counterfactual, what you don't see, what it would have been if we would have had a more logical tax policy. We want to move in this direction, or do you want to move in this direction? I think it should be obvious to you which direction we should be trying to move into. And I tell you, this is the money that's being captured by the investors. Okay, Nordhaus would say 2 to 5% is being captured by the investors. So there is enormous value that's being created for consumers and for people in the rest of the world that's pulling the whole world out of poverty. So if you were in the rest of the world, what do you think about California? Why is everybody taking risk in California? Because the value of being in Silicon Valley is way greater than the difference in the California tax rate, which is tiny in comparison, okay? Now, you're in the rest of the world, you don't live in California. Oh, by the way, that little incremental difference in California, what's happening to their students? Not a damn thing. What's happening to their poverty? Not a damn thing, okay? That's not what's doing any changes. You look at this versus any other state, it's not that different. Okay, what's really happening is all you smart people, we're training you in the world, and then we're sucking you all into California who didn't pay for you, and you're taking enormous risks because of the synergies, because of the trade-offs, because of the things that you're going to learn by mining the technological frontier. And then some municipal labor union is going to come along and say, voila, we can tax the living crap out of you. And you know what? It won't slow down growth enough for anybody to matter. Although if you looked at the counterfactual, which is the best one we have, you would see that it can make a huge difference on the expected return, and we're going to just cut them in half. Okay, cut them in half. It's insane. And oh, by the way, when you tax the first dollar and not the incremental dollar, okay, you're more than cutting it in half. You're taking all this stuff and saying all this stuff is uneconomical. Like if you don't have more than a 30 times payoff on a 1 in 20 shot, it's not economical to take that bet. So what if you're in the rest of the world? Would you let California tax that? Hell no. You'd say that is an asset of the world. That is pulling the world out of poverty. And California has no right to slow that down. To do what? To get their test scores up? Take a look at their test scores. They're not up. To get their people out of poverty? They're not out of poverty. To help the children? Bullshit. Okay, we're helping the children. Okay, on spending money in education, we spend the same amount per student, and I can show it to you state by state and district by district. Okay, And yes, we ought to spend more money, perhaps, helping, poor people more than rich people, because maybe poor people have a harder time to learn. But do we really need to spend that much more? And if we spend that much more and we don't get any increase in test score, at some point you have to step back and say, am I getting any return on my investment? Because we don't have any way to take a low score and turn them into a high score. And by the way, neither does Canada, and neither does Europe, and neither does the rest of the world. Okay? Nobody's able to take a person with a low score. And all these Einsteins, it sounds reasonable. We are testing people in kindergarten. And we are testing them in the 4th grade, and we are testing them in the 8th grade. And you know what? We can't find any increase in test scores, short ones that are temporary. And you know what we learn on the other side? Oh, it's all pre-verbal, so we can't measure it. Really? Really? Well, this is pre-verbal right here. Here it is, pre-verbal, $17,000 a year. It's not pre-verbal, but it's before school. We're not getting any increase in test scores. So we can say in a reasonable tone, we ought to, cut the spending a little bit. We ought to raise the taxes a little bit. And we're pretty close to equilibrium. And so I don't know why people have their hair on fire, but people should have their hair on fire. If they really looked at the data, if they really understood what was underneath this all, you would see that the reasonable tone isn't warranted. And I am not trying to say the world is a hellscape. It is not. Okay? That's the problem. You don't see the real cost of the fiscal policy because we're borrowing in debt at 0% interest rates, which is just beginning to bite us. It's beginning to bite us because even after we drove spending to 100% of GDP, okay, and even when we held taxes at the historical norm, which I was against, okay, it wasn't until we started consuming 6.5% of GDP that the interest rate started to rise. And the reason for that is because, and we'll get to this in the trade deficit, there is an enormous surplus of offshore savings. So, all right, he took a long time, so filibustering, okay?
We both have to cut it back a little. So
All right, I'll say 2 more sentences then and shut up. Okay. There was a surplus of savings, and it was going to subprime consumption before the financial crisis. And after the financial crisis, I said, don't run up big fiscal deficits as a way to use this money. And that's exactly what we did. I said, this will make us dependent on offshore savings. We should not be careful about being dependent on offshore savings. We should be careful about this. And we did that, and we drove up the spending, and we did it all with 0 interest rates. And now the interest rates are biting, and it's going to be a bigger problem than the moderate tone indicates.
Okay, so I'll agree on some things and disagree on others. I'll agree that my tone is moderate. I will disagree with the claim that I use a calculator to do my budget analysis. I use a spreadsheet for that. This welfare benefits, I think this chart is probably looming large because it's one of 2 charts, which is a much smarter strategy than giving people like a blizzard of 50 slides. First of all, people have studied these programs. They've studied them really carefully. They've looked at families that have and haven't gotten them. They found the kids 30 years later. They found, causal random variation, like giving someone a drug versus not in a study. And the benefits in terms of long-term mobility of the earned income tax credit, of nutritional assistance, of health care. Look at the kid 30 years later.
And no one's saying
they're less likely to be in prison, more likely to be in a job, et cetera. The magnitudes, 11,000, the typical person, the median single mother of 3 makes well more than that. At minimum wage in most states, you're making
$15 an hour here times 2,000 hours is $30,000.
Right. I was going to do that with my head. Didn't even need a calculator for that one. Rent and heat, that's a program, by the way, that less than 1/5 of the people eligible get. So this is sort of an example of if you run the table and get every possible program, most families get a pretty small subset of those programs. And it misses that we actually have changed the way we provide social assistance to people. 40 years ago, it primarily was for people that don't work. In many cases, it required you not to work in order to receive it. That got a lot of criticism, especially from conservatives. That was embodied in welfare reform that President Clinton did. And since then, we've shifted over to ways of supporting people that in many, not all cases, in many cases required work in a number of cases, give you more money if you work than if you don't work.
And then have shifted
And
back.
so we've shifted over to things like the earned income tax credit. So today, when you look at the entire suite of social assistance programs, some of them encourage you to work. Some of them, correct, but that's also more.
Just to add the perspective, here's what he's talking about. I'm telling you, if you get out your calculator and do the math, earned income tax credit, Democrats took the work requirements off. President Clinton put them on. President Obama took some of them off. President Biden took some of them off. He just mentioned the one that you have to work for to get earned income tax credit, which, by the way, you don't have to work for it anymore to get. That's $7,400.
Okay.
Just
Ed, you were showing. Okay, look, this is somebody making $11,000. If their earnings go up to say $20,000 or $30,000, which is a very, very typical amount to make, that earned income tax credit thing grows. It grows because it's actually rewarding work. This thing for most families is actually zero. It's not 22,000. So there's a big difference. There's a big difference between the typical.
If you live in the South, it's going to be
zero.
And
it goes to zero. So if you look at the way our social assistance is delivered, it has the parts that have grown have been related to healthcare, some of which requires work, some of which don't, and has been in the things like the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, which also requires work.
As long as you realize, take the money, divide by the number of people in the bottom 20%, and you get $90,000 per household. So somehow or another, after he says nobody's getting on this money, then it must all be going to the middle class, which is just buying votes from the middle class instead of buying votes from the poor. But somehow you got to take $1.5 trillion and divide it into whatever number you want to divide it into. And I took the bottom 20% of households, and that's $90,000 per household. So I don't know who's taking what away from whom, but at the end of the day, you got to get back to $90,000.
Let's go out to like poorer areas of Boston and see if everyone has $90,000 each, and then we can revisit that math. Two more things, and then we can get to other topics.
Do you disagree?
On the budget numbers, I agree. We are in an unsustainable place. I agree that CBO is over-optimistic of somewhat different reasons than you get you to the same place. I agree that the sooner we make an adjustment, the better. So I'm not entirely sure what you're sort of worried about me on that score. And then the final thing I'd say is I think, Ed, that a lot of your arguments suffer from something that we try to place a lot of emphasis on in the class I teach, probably do it in an oversimplified way for Harvey's taste, so try not to be too mean to me, Harvey, which is just to distinguish between positive and normative. And that's, again, where the trade-offs matter. Normative is what are your values? What do you want the income distribution to look like? What do you want poverty to look like? What do you care about national security? What do you care about national identity? All these things, different people have different values on all of them. Another value is related to taxes. Do you get to deserve the money you earned because you worked hard? You're like your daughter. Or do you sort of not have any right to it because it should just be, whatever you do, your money should go away to wherever society wants it to be? These are really, really important values. A lot of the debates on taxes among professional economists who study this come down more to those values issues. Is it fair or unfair to tax someone at over 50%? Is it fair or unfair to tax someone at 33% than they do on the positive ones? And I think, Ed, that you're sort of mixing in the positive and normative without being clear about where you see the world functioning differently versus you have you have different values, which I think is totally legitimate and fair to have.
I don't think I do have different values, by the way. I think I want to get poor people to be as rich as they can possibly be, okay? And I want to do that over the long run, not over the short run. Because you can always, I used to be an investor. You want to get the earnings up, you can cannibalize the future and get the earnings up. Now, is anybody going to pay you for a cannibalized future? No, because they're going to look forward in the future and say, you didn't invest in your factories, you didn't invest in maintenance, you didn't invest in R&D, you didn't invest in product development. You don't invest in all those things, you can get the profits up. You want to help the poor next year? You can do that. You want to help the world's poor over the next 50 years? Whole different thing. And so I always resent this. Oh, conservatives, we don't care about the poor. We have different values. We're selfish. No. The reason why I'm a conservative is because I think it's better for the poor, a lot better for the poor. This is a lot better for the poor than this. And it's not just this or this. It's what are you trying to do at the margin? And so no one is saying that we should take everybody's benefits away. But it's also the case that we are spending $1.5 trillion on, which is it's amounting to about $80,000, $90,000 per poor household. So I don't know where that money's going, but then if we need to take it away from the middle class because somebody's using it to buy votes in the middle class, let's do that. I don't think it's actually the case, but some of it's going there. But when you actually reconcile to the math, I think you're going to find out it's not quite as unreasonable as as I don't sound as unreasonable as my tone is because I'm shocked by it. And so no, I don't agree with you that our values are different. I don't agree with you that our values are different at all because I would say we want to help poor people get a better education. We want to get their test scores up as high as we possibly can. But if we can't get them up, then the question is, should we keep spending more and more and more? Should we hold it at the level that we're at? Should we think about what the return on investment that we're getting on that and do something reasonable and logical? I think the same thing, by the way, happens in global warming, and this will be a little bit more controversial. But I think a lot of people feel guilty about global warming. I do too, okay? But there's something called Jevons paradox, which is the cheaper we make something, the more it's going to get used. So if we take our economy and we stop using oil so that oil is more plentiful and the price goes down, we have a problem, which is the rest of the world is going to use more oil. And so did we close global warming, reduce global warming, or did we just shift it off to our prosperity off to the rest of the world? And if we had held the prosperity here, instead of shifting it off to the rest of the world, would the world have been better off for it? And you can always say, you know what, I'm not going to look at Jevons paradox, which I'm going to guess 80% of the people in this room never even heard the word Jevons paradox before. But you can't have a conversation about global warming if you don't talk about Jevons paradox, because there really are trade-offs that matter at the margin. And so, that's the case in global warming. I'm all for trying to reduce the emissions, but if you don't really reduce the emissions, then you haven't really done anything. So if you haven't improved the test scores, I do have a slide on the test scores, by the way. If we put it on the projector, they haven't gone up a whit over this time. So, each one of these things, we're not producing the results that we claim that we're producing, and we're doing it at enormous increases of expenditures, which are largely just being handed out to people, whether it's the poor or the middle class, to buy their votes.
Now let's pause and consult the audience. Stunned by these two brilliant presentations. Nonetheless, maybe there's a question.
Harvey has it.
Thank you. I'm Tom Palmer. I was a former journalist for 40 years. My assessment was that very few journalists understood economics, and I think our policy, the reporting on policy, reflects that. My question is very simple. Isn't a recession the only way out of this, and isn't the sooner the better?
Well, I would say, hell no, that's even more expensive. Okay, so no, but would it hold down interest rates? Perhaps, but at an enormous cost. You want to avoid recessions. And that's part of the problem with Trump, I think, which is, you shock the system, you're going to get a recession. If you want to impose tariffs, and we can talk about that later, you want to do that gradually, thoughtfully, over time, give people time to respond, to make adjustments. Investments take you years in order to plan, to do. You think you're going to change the whole world in a week and a half? That's just going to send things spiraling downward as everybody scrambles to get out of the way. So, no, I don't think, I don't subscribe to this Hayekian view that it's a overinvestment that has to be cut back, even though I think there is excess risk taking at times and at the peak. But no is no and hell no.
I agree. Same thing.
Now, younger people can ask questions.
Thanks to you both for the stimulating exchange of views. Question for each of you. Professor Furman, you said Medicare could spend a lot less, but you were in the Obama administration, and I remember talking about how the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare was going to bend the cost curve down. I don't know if that happened, but why not? And for Ed Conard, You say nobody wants to cannibalize the future to get current earnings. That's not the way sensible people think. Doesn't that happen like over and over again? I'm thinking of Jack Welch, of Boeing, of other great companies where investors seem precisely to have done that.
Oh, that's the
So
first one.
So on the
quick, which is
second one,
R&D.
oh, sorry, the first, the healthcare spending. The trustees come out with a report every year which says how big is the gap in the hospital insurance part of Medicare, which is the only part that's funded on what's intended to be a self-financing trust fund. And prior to the Affordable Care Act, it was 3.5% gap. So that said you need to raise taxes by 3.5% or cut spending by an equivalent amount. Now it's 0.2%. So if we took Medicare payroll taxes, which right now are 2.9% in general, they're higher for high-income people, and raise them from 2.9 to 3.1, that would bring you solvency within the hospital insurance part of it. So there's been a dramatic improvement in Medicare's outlook. That was just hospital insurance because that's the only one they measure in that way. But if you look at Medicare spending as a whole, in the decade after the Affordable Care Act, it came in more than $1 trillion lower than what CBO had projected, even with the projections that incorporated the spending reductions. And if you look at national health expenditures, they've actually been falling as a share of GDP for the last couple of years for the first time in a long time. So health spending has risen, absolutely. It's risen as a share of GDP. It's risen at a slower pace, considerably slower pace than it did before. But we didn't do as much in that law as I would have liked to have done to further slow it. And in particular, I think it's hard to do much more on Medicare without doing more on the beneficiary side, telling people they need more cost sharing. And Obama, in his budget, proposed raising the Medicare age from 65 to 67. That's not something any Democrat or any Republican would talk about today. I don't think there's a single Republican who's out. Put it in our budget, 65 to 67. Making people pay more to go to the doctor, et cetera, things on the beneficiary side that have left the conversation.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, by the way. I think if you just looked at the numbers, I think Medicare spending per capita, for example, I don't have it per old person, but was like at $1,800. At the end of the Obama administration, it was at $2,350. By 2024, it's at $2,500. So it's risen a little bit, but you largely do that by just restricting the amount of money that you're willing to spend on people. They used to call that death panels, the Republicans called that, but lurking behind the scenes, you have to have some kind of spending control that says you're not going to spend on everything. And we've definitely tightened it up since then and slowed the growth down relative to what it was before, largely with death panels that nobody will admit to. But on R&D, public companies spend more on R&D as a percent of their total profits, sales, relative to assets, any way you want to look at it, versus private companies. So if public companies just cared about their earnings, not their long-term earnings, you wouldn't expect to see something like that because R&D is riskier than most investment, but R&D is what's really driving all the growth today. It's not capital investment where we increase capacity after we've got a good idea. Most of these companies are cash flow positive, by the way, so they're contributing to savings. But the place where they're spending the money is in R&D, and the R&D expenditures have ramped up, and they've ramped up the highest on, that's not me. They've ramped up the highest in public companies. So do public companies manage their earnings? Yeah, but investors aren't stupid. They look forward in the future and they go, is Microsoft going to be able to compete with Google on artificial intelligence? And if they're not pouring money into R&D and capital expenditures to develop AI models, their stock price is going to go down, not up. People are worried Facebook's not going to be able to compete with them. Or Meta.
I'll come over. I have a general suggestion. There are a lot of young people in this room who are not economists and who...
But there's still time for them, as opposed to the older people.
That's true,
where
but
it's
who
just
don't know maybe even what R&D is or what. So I think since you both got your big disagreements out of the way, and maybe people who watch this video on YouTube, maybe some of them won't watch this far, we could make this part of the discussion a little bit more targeted to people who are economically illiterate. Would you appreciate that?
I would only say this: we don't want you to be economists, okay? We want you to be talented risk takers who've gotten properly prepared in your career. We want you to know enough about the
healthcare
economy.
discussion, I think, is really important because so much of what the federal government does on the domestic side has to do with paying for healthcare costs. Social Security costs have been sort of managed, and Medicare has partially been managed. But the biggest problem out there today is when we pay all of the medical costs for a population. And we're doing that for veterans, and we're doing that for people of low income, and we're doing that for people of low to middle income. And the Obama administration greatly expanded that segment of the population that was receiving all of their medical benefits with essentially no payments. Now, when you can get free medical care, you will have people maxing out, demanding the most expensive services, which is going to the emergency room or going into the hospital instead of seeking out less expensive alternatives. So that's been the dynamic, one of the dynamic factors on the expenditure side. So I'd like to hear if you would be willing, if you would think this would be a step forward, if we would ask people who are currently getting health care for free, if they'd be willing to support payments, co-payments, whatever kinds of phrases you want to use, so they would be managing their healthcare situation. Did I avoid any economic fancy terms there? Yes.
So, first of all, I agree there is a trade-off. When someone pays more for your health insurance, you're going to likely spend more. And you want to get to the best place on that trade-off.
I didn't say more. I said
No.
all. If they're going to pay for
Right.
all of it,
Right.
what's going to happen
Right.
then?
For within Medicaid, which is the health insurance program for poor people, there's very little cost sharing. So the government's basically paying all. The government puts very, very big restrictions, though, on which doctors you can go to and effectively what services you can get. So they're paying 100%, but they're paying 100% of something that's quite limited and reimbursed at quite a low rate. In general, the larger the fraction that's not where most of the spending is. The larger the fraction is paid, the more people spend. That's an issue not just in the government stuff, but on the private side as well, because people don't see how much their health insurance costs. Most of the premium comes out of their wages, but they don't realize it because their employer paid it, and they don't realize their wages are lower because their employer paid it. And so when they're comparing plans, they're effectively not thinking that ultimately they're the ones who are paying all of it. That happens because we spend a couple $100 billion a year on a tax subsidy for employer-sponsored insurance. So I think the entire health conversation in the United States is not just public and private. People don't see that you are paying more to get more, and is it worth it? In some cases it is, in other cases it isn't, and we don't have a mechanism for doing that. So what could we do? I'm not honestly very worried about Medicaid. It is relatively cheap per person that gets it. But I agree with you on more cost sharing in general. I have proposed cost sharing that would be income related. So as your income goes up, you have more co-payments, more co-insurance, pay when you go to the doctor. And in general, no one really likes that because everyone wants everyone to get free everything. Right. But so I guess I agree with you directionally, but worry about it in both the public and private sector.
Yeah, I'd have three thoughts on this. When President Obama came to office, Jason was in the administration, we probably were spending too little money on healthcare for the poor. And that, there was a lot of tension there and maybe it needed to be increased. And it did increase. Now, I think we did a couple of things, like for example, I once said to you, Jason, you probably forget this, that President Obama will be remembered as the greatest liberal president in the history because he was able to get more health care for the poor. One thing I'd say to keep in mind is the census, for example, values healthcare to the poor at 15 cents on the dollar, because they said if the poor could sell their healthcare policy that they were getting from the government, they'd eagerly sell it for 15 cents on the dollar. So when you look at the census, they only count 15 cents. But two things that we did that caused it to get more out of control than it needed to get. We put in a 9-to-1 sharing ratio that said the federal government's going to pay for it all. States have to put in $1 for every $9 that the federal government puts in. That was to encourage the states to get as aggressive as that the Obama administration could possibly get them to do. And then the states started putting taxes on healthcare spending in their organizations, in their industries, in order to raise the money for the 10%, whatever it is, 1/9, 1/10, so that they wouldn't have to put any money in. And that drove the spending more out of control than it probably needed to be, but it probably needed to go up from where it was. So just to put it in perspective, it was about $1,300 in 2007. It was at about $2,000 per head, per capita at 2016. It had grown during the Trump to 2,143, so not a lot. And then between there and President Biden, 2,500. So there was an enormous increase after the pandemic that didn't go away after things went back to normal. So we've had, and the effect of that money-wise is when President Obama left office, we were spending about $685 billion. Now we're spending $858 billion, so that's $200 billion difference. Just to put that in perspective, in Medicare's gone up by about $150 billion a year difference. So there's been an enormous increase in Medicaid spending since the Biden administration took office, and I would say that's the piece of Medicare that, if I were trying to answer your question and say you want people to have more restraint, you want states to have more restraint, that you can't have 1 in 10 spending, you can't let them fund all of their 10% with a tax that means they haven't put anything in, they're actually getting more back than they're putting in. It's crazy. And so we're driving it out of control as a matter of policy. And a more logical policy with a little more restraint, especially when the recipients value it at 15 cents on the dollar, okay, would lead us to a better spot that we're in. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have health care for the poor. It just means that we shouldn't let it grow as fast as we're letting it grow. And it probably needed to be greater than it was.
Can we make the next question after this from somebody under the age of 30?
Well, I was about to say that I volunteered to be both among the young people and the economically illiterate.
Well, you got one.
Not that we don't want your question. I'm just speaking to who comes next.
I'd like, if you would, to talk a little bit about tariffs. And is the current tariff regime leading us to an imminent recession? And the second question is, we have a national debt now, which is what, 30 some odd trillion dollars?
100% of GDP.
I think it's more than 100% of GDP. Question is, how high can that go before it precipitates an economic cataclysm?
Do you want to? Oh, you want me to
Those
go
are
first?
two big questions. So we could both go on a long time.
Second one, on the debt as a share of GDP, I would be more focused on, is it on a downslope rather than where it is. So if you could guarantee me that it was going to, over a century, go from 125% of GDP to 100% of GDP, I would sleep quite easily.
It's going the other way.
No, I understand. No. I'm just telling you what I would focus less on getting it down and more on stabilizing it. And the other thing where I agree with Ed, if you look at all of our debt today, you can think of it as effectively having come from three things: a war against Nazi Germany and Japan, a financial crisis, and a pandemic. Those three events. So you want it, and this is something Ed said, you want it to be going down quite a lot, because every now and then it's going to ratchet itself back up. On your first question,
I want to add two more places where the debt has come from. Okay, after the financial crisis and after the pandemic, in both cases, Democrats spent more. They increased the rate of spending afterwards. So the debt rose, and they didn't say now we need to moderate and let it drive down, like he says we need to do. They said, how can we spend more, and who cares if it goes up? So it's come from that as well, and it's also now coming from the fact that We borrowed a whole bunch of money at 0 interest rates, but at 4% interest rates, 5% interest rates, it starts compounding. Now, that's 3% for the government or 2.5%, whatever, we can do the calculation. But at those, we're getting a compounding effect now, which is concerning.
On tariffs, you said the current regime. If we keep alternating between tariffs of like 10% and 145% and changing it every 3 days, I'm quite certain we'll have a recession. Or not reasonably certain we'll have a recession. If the tariffs stay frozen in place exactly where they are without the promised increases that are supposed to happen 75 or some odd days from now, then it could go either way. And the tariffs by themselves, I think, are probably not sufficient enough for a recession. It would be the confidence and uncertainty effects that would be. If they came down, maybe we could dodge one. But I don't think a recession is the right way to think about tariffs and trade, because the issue is, and this goes back to something that Ed has stressed that I quite agree, what does it do to our growth and our living standards over the longer term? And in general, countries that do more of what they're good at and buy more of what other people are good at making are more prosperous, both in level terms and in growth terms. And the tariffs we have now put us at an average tariff rate that is higher than Iran, Venezuela, and every other country they're higher than is not nearly as successful as Iran and Venezuela are. So we are in a place that I think will reduce living standards over the longer term by quite a lot.
Ricardo's law, in other words.
Yeah.
So
amended by Krugman and other research about the benefits of increasing returns to scale that Ricardo hadn't understood.
I have a lot of thoughts on this. First thing I think you realize is, does President Trump really have the legal authority to put tariffs on all imports? I suspect not, and what's going to end up happening is there'll be an injunction, it'll be upheld by the Supreme Court, and he won't have the rights without Congress actually imposing the tariffs. So what has he probably really done? He put down an opening bid, and I'll talk about his opening bid in a second, but take the 10%, for example. If Congress has to vote on it, it's probably going to end up at 5% if it ends up at anything at all. So what he proposed, and you see his negotiating strategy, which is to start big and threaten everybody and back off. Do I think that can lead to a recession? Yes. I think among sophisticated investors, they're getting a better understanding of how it works, and then they react less afterwards than they did initially. Smart money comes in and starts buying when the market drops. So do I worry a lot about a recession? Yeah, I do. And do I worry that the guy's going to destroy wealth? Yes. And is it his personality more than tariffs? Yes. But if he put forward a 10% tariff, and then we'll talk about his other piece of his tariffs, which is, and that ends up being 5%, I don't think a lot of production is going to move to the United States as a result of a 5% tariff. So there's not going to be a lot of disallocation. Just largely put a 5% tax on 15% of GDP, which is largely consumption. And we need more tax revenues. And if it was done as a border adjustment tax instead of as a tariff, which is very similar, you'd have a hard time, not being an economist, telling the two apart. Okay? It probably would just raise some revenues without having a big effect on the economy. It's the way he does it that has the big effect. Now, the other thing that he adds is, if you don't balance trade, I'm going to put punitive tariffs on you. So we are running enormous fiscal deficits, and we need a lot of savings to fund those deficits, and a lot of those savings come from abroad. So if you squelch trade deficits, which I was against after the financial crisis, and said, don't let the rest of the world export their excess savings to the United States, because that's going to create all kinds of problems, not the least of which is an enormous growth in spending and large deficits, which I predicted and said we shouldn't do back in 2014 when my first book came out. But it's too late now, we did it, okay? So now if you say, I want to have balanced trade, you're shutting yourself off from a whole bunch of savings offshore that you need to fund the deficit. So if you're going to do that, you better cut the costs or raise taxes and drive the deficit down so you're less dependent on foreign savings. Because we have stupidly, foolishly addicted everybody to increased spending levels so that they don't want to cut a nickel out of that, and they don't want to cut a nickel out of the 80,000 people that work in the State Department, and then we don't want to raise taxes the 35% that we'd have to raise them. So we're going to need the money from somewhere. So we probably need unbalanced trade to do it. But if we didn't need the unbalanced trade to fund the fiscal deficit, what he did was actually kind of clever, because he went to countries and he said, if you don't balance trade, I'm going to put a very high tax on everything that's coming in. So the incremental tax on the little bit that they need to balance the trade is enormous. So you're going to buy a Boeing plane or you're going to buy an Airbus. The tax on that Airbus plane is enormous. And so what he really did was put a tax on the competition of US exports in countries that run trade surpluses. Not such a bad idea, if it wasn't for the fact that we desperately need their savings in order to fund our deficit. And he did that unilaterally, by the way, because he did it with a formula on every country. Now, did I think it was excessive? Do I think we should be trying to balance trade when we need a lot of offshore money? Heck no, okay? But I also saw it as an opening bid and a negotiation. You know, that's what I spent my whole life doing, negotiating. I sat here with a guy, partner of mine, the guy ran out in the hall and puked when the guy told us we weren't going to get the deal. And he came back, I went out in the hall and I said, dude, they're going to give us the deal, okay? You don't need to puke over this. Like, everybody lights their hair on fire when the negotiation starts. That's how negotiations go. The guy's a negotiator. Take a chill pill. Don't light your hair on fire every time he asks for an outrageous demand. That's how you get to a reasonable outcome. But do I think it's good for the economy? No. I think it scares the hell out of everybody. The dumb money goes flying, the smart money comes in. You don't want the smart money getting the money, by the way. Those are the guys you're trying to prevent from getting the money.
I just want to address the negotiation thing. Let's say we got a deal where Vietnam eliminated not just all of its tariffs, but all of its non-tariff barriers for US exports. Let's say Japan did it too. Let's say Malaysia did it too. Maybe get another 10 countries. That would be a really, really good deal. We had that deal. It was called the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
And we should have
Donald
done it.
Trump pulled us out of it. And Hillary Clinton said she would have pulled us out of it if she was elected too. So these deals of 0 for 0, which are being talked about, that's called a free trade agreement. We have them with a couple dozen, maybe like 15 countries around the world right now. Every one of them we got without anything like these antics. We were most of the way towards negotiating with Europe and 100% of the way towards getting one with Asia. So I don't think he wants 0 for 0 would be the first thing. The second thing is we talked about a broader based lower rate before for tax system, a tariff, 5% tariff on imports. Imports are 10% of GDP. You could raise just as much money with a 0.7% tax on all of consumption. I would much rather have a 0.7% tax than a 5%
already have.
tax.
I don't know what your sales tax here is. 18. I mean, 8 probably. But when you drive it up to 15, you might not be so happy
The last point
about
I'd
that.
say is 5% isn't a lot, but there's two sides to that. The flip side is it's not a lot on the other end either. The concessions we want are relatively small because these countries are very, very open to American exports already. And so the best case scenario of winning in a negotiation is not actually that great a thing for us. It's a good thing for us, but it's not that great a thing. And the cost of being stuck here, a 5% tariff rate would put us below Iran and Venezuela, but it would put us above every other rich and successful country in the world.
I think one of the things you find, though, is when people put tariffs on exports, on imports, okay, it tends to drive up their currency, which means they're pushing some of the taxes off onto other countries. And so to the extent other countries put tariffs on their imports and we don't put them on ours, and in general, I wouldn't put them on ours, but we are absorbing some of their tax increase as a result. So what you find in border adjustment taxes, for example, is the belief that by putting border adjustment taxes on, we can push some of our taxes off on the rest of the world if they don't, quote unquote, retaliate. Now, keep in mind, retaliation is I put a gun to my head and say, I'll shoot myself if you do this to me, okay? Which is I'll tax my people if you tax your people. Okay, go ahead, tax your people, we don't care. But why do we care about it? Because it pushes some of their taxes off on us if it strengthens their currency relative to our currency. So we have to be a little bit careful. All right, go ahead.
Thank you both for coming. I appreciate your guys' passion in this. I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit to housing because I think it's something that we haven't necessarily talked about. And I think it's a particular issue that's pertinent to young people. I think it's safe to say that the income levels aren't rising at the same rate as housing prices. The state where I'm from, California, I think it's safe to say is on the precipice of a housing crisis, if not in one. While housing policy isn't necessarily directly related to government subsidies, I think that there is definitely interplay between government policy and the current housing situation. So can you talk about like what you think the solutions to the housing crisis would be and how your specific recommendations would improve the housing situation, especially for young people?
Right. The solution is more supply. When supply goes up, price goes down. The constraint on supply isn't the amount of land in the country. There's an awful lot of it. There's even an awful lot of land here in Cambridge or in San Francisco or wherever you're from in California. It's all of the mostly local and state rules that limit how much you can build, make it harder to build. And so the local, YIMBY, yes in my backyard movement, which is having some successes in places across the country. Montana and Massachusetts have both passed laws along these lines, is to me the sort of first, second, and third most important ways to solve the housing issue. You can build higher, you don't need to have as much of a yard, you don't need as many parking spaces, you don't need to go through as many permits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all that type of change.
Well, I would agree it's the second, but it's not the first. The first is the government is sucking all the savings out and spending it on consumption. That's going to drive up interest rates. That's going to make housing unaffordable. And normally housing prices go down when interest rates go up. But because we underbuilt the supply of housing, because we sucked down all the savings for consumption, the housing didn't get built. And now that your generation is coming along, there's a lot of demand for housing. The supply is tight. And the interest rates are high because we spent all the zero interest rate money. And the second thing we did, which I'll put as the third cause, is it used to be before the financial crisis that real estate captures some of the value in the economy. If you own a store in Harvard Square and the economy goes up, the value of that land underneath that store is going to go up and the rents are going to go up in that store. So the owner of that land captures some of the value in the economy, and the homeowners were capturing some of the value prior to the financial crisis. And they were able to borrow against the rising value of their home and consume that money. And that was a way for them to get a share of the growth that was happening in the economy. We lit our hair on fire after the financial crisis. I said it's not so bad that homeowners are doing this. We just need to be thoughtful about it. But we pretty much shut it down. Okay? That had an effect on housing prices. That would have caused more housing to be built between here and there. The other thing that happened, by the way, is that we suffered a much longer recession because all of these excess savings that we had prior to the financial crisis, that was going into housing and then being sucked out into consumption. After we shut that down, we didn't have another use for those savings. So we suffered a paradox of thrift and a slow recovery as a result. And the only way we got out of that was by increasing fiscal deficits, increasing government spending in order to put that money together. But it sucked all the money out of housing because housing is where the incremental dollar has gone historically. It's the thing, and oh, by the way, I'll go one step further, which is what do politicians do to get votes? They love having overheated housing markets because all the homeowners are voting for them because, oh boy, their housing prices are high, but it's not sustainable. And then it crashes. And then, they say, oh, it wasn't me. But of course it was because they overheated it in the first place. If you want the Hayekian thing, that's where it's happening. But anyway.
Thank you both for teaching me quite a lot today. I did have a question about something I feel like we didn't touch a ton on, and that's like the rise of artificial intelligence. I think it goes without saying that AI threatens the lowest quartile of our constituency and the fact that it's difficult for them to adjust. I've heard a lot of talk circulating around potentially a UBI that helps temporarily at least shift the impact of that technological change, masking the impact to that lower quartile. If you don't agree with that idea, do you have any other ideas to help us transition into this new space?
Well, first of all, the more AI we have, the more income we're going to have. And the more income we're going to have, the more options we're going to have to make ourselves better off. And so I'm not worried about it. In fact, I'd be worried that we'd have too little AI and AI will be too slow. And this administration actually, I think, has reduced some of the regulations, and we're going to get a little bit faster AI, although it's going to be quite fast in any scenario. The second thing I'd say is I tend to not be worried that it's going to take all the jobs and cause inequality. I think it's going to complement skills, give people better paid jobs and the like, but I'm not sure I'm right. If I'm wrong, I'd rather do things like wage subsidies so that people, can work and get compensated for their work in the age of AI rather than UBI. But if we're in a world where literally the robots can do everything people do, then sure, figure out some new system where everyone can just, live for free on the robots. But that last system feels to me so far away that rather than like you doing a homework project to design a UBI, you can just wait, and like 50 years from now, the robots can come up with like an even better way to do UBI than you would have figured out yourself.
A couple thoughts. First of all, if you're worried about robots, they already came, okay? And don't jump on me here. We had tens of millions of Hispanic immigrants who came across the border. They're better robots, cheaper paid than we're ever going to get out of AI for 50 years, okay? They are outstanding. They're smarter. They're more flexible. So if you're worried about the effect of robots on wages, the robots already came. And I'm not trying to be disparaging in any way. I'm saying that's the effect. And I think they probably made people richer, not poor, by the way. Okay, so we've seen the effect of AI. We've also seen the effect of AI in companies and in governments and in the economy and in the internet. So those are super intelligent beings. They're way more capable, Ford Motor Company is way more capable of thinking about a car than any one individual is. So we're already living with AI. It's powerful and it's made our lives better off, not worse off. And do we have to control them with regulation? Heck yeah. Do we have to pit one against the other, the government against private enterprise, regulation against the social media industry? Yeah, it takes a lot of back and forth fight and tension. You want like steroids in sports where, it doesn't gain you much advantage because both sides taking it and they fight each other to a draw. So we do have examples of where I's taken over. One thing I'd say as well is if you look at what if robots can do everything? Well, I think there's two scenarios there. One is only rich people own all the robots and robots can do everything. Okay, and they're going to hoard all the production for themselves. What would everybody else do? They do what we're doing right now. Okay, that's what we're doing. We're living in a world without AI. So if 90% of the people don't get the robots and there's this 1% that owns all the robots and nobody can do anything, they'd say, well, one of two things has to be true. Either the robot's got to be doing stuff for me or I got to be doing it for myself. And if I have to do it for myself, it looks like this. Not so bad. Okay, and I think what you would discover is the rich people with robots would end up with a lot of spillover technology that everybody else would use. And the question would be like, you lost supervision from the rich people who are the talented people who ended up owning all the robots, or the lucky people, ever want to describe it. But the question would be the loss of supervision, because they were now supervising the robots instead of everybody else. What would the effect of that be on everybody else versus the spillover effects that would happen? And as I showed you, us versus Europe, our guys are getting 1/4 of the supervision of the guys in Europe, Northern Europe, and they're doing better because the spillover is greater. So, but should we be worried about AI? Heck yeah, we ought to be worried about AI, just like we should be worried about nuclear weapons. Let's not kid ourselves.
One more question. People have to go to a class.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Hi, thank you both for the discussion today. I think it was really insightful. I want to ask a question about fiscal policy and budget deficits, because I think there was a lot of debate about how we ought to reduce the deficits. Should we reduce spending? Maybe we'll do modest spending reductions and modest tax reductions. Fundamentally, that's like an empirical problem that's pretty solvable. If you go to the CFRB's website, you can sort of play around with their budget tool. I encourage you all to do so. It's not a particularly challenging technical problem. It's actually a pretty challenging political problem. As far as I can see it in a two-party system, the budget is sort of like a game of chicken. And over the last 30 years, Republicans were a little bit better at playing chicken than Democrats were. And under the Biden administration, Democrats got a little bit better at playing chicken. How do we actually solve this problem? I know, Jason, you said we need bipartisan solutions, but I'm sort of pessimistic about that working now, especially as compared to the past. So what's going to change, and how is this problem actually going to get solved? And how do we overcome that basic game theory?
That's what you've got your MA in government, so.
Yeah. So I agree with everything you said about how the problem is defined. I agree with everything you said about going to the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget website to get all the possible solutions. I see three possible forcing mechanisms. One, if interest rates really start to rise and people link that to the budget deficit, that could change our politics. That's part of what happened in the 1980s and early 1990s. Interest rates were much higher than they were now, and that led the political system to care more about this. A second is there's some accounting forcing events. Social Security and Medicare trust funds get exhausted a decade from now. Now, Congress could pass a law saying ignore that and just keep paying the benefits and cheat. But, in the past at least, it's had some, moral suasion. The last, and I don't quite know how this happens, is maybe it becomes politically more important. Ross Perot, this is one of the two big issues he campaigned on as a third-party candidate in 1992. And Bill Clinton, in order to win the election, said he cared more about the deficit than he had said before. And then when he was elected, he sort of stuck with it, and like the Fed chair sort of pushed it, et cetera. And this past election, we had a third-party candidate who's now the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and he had all sorts of issues, but the deficit was not high up on his list. So maybe it will come back politically into fashion. I don't know quite which way it would. I'm reasonably confident, though, that left to their own devices, neither party could do very much about it. And I actually think Democrats could do a little bit more about it, because it's easier to raise taxes on the rich politically on a party line vote than it is to cut, benefits, no matter how high you think those benefits are. And I think we're going to see that this year, that a party line does very, very little in the way of benefit cuts on Medicaid. But we need to get back to the bipartisan thing. And I don't quite know how we get there, but those are some of the ways maybe.
Yeah, I'll give a couple of thoughts on it. First of all, if you were serious about protecting America, you never would have let it happen in the first place, because once it happens, I think it's largely unsolvable without a crisis. Because I don't think you can get either side to do the things that are necessary. And I don't think voters don't understand the order of the magnitude of what's required. The second is I kind of disagree with who's responsible for the problem, but only in this way. Democrats got permanent spending increases. Republicans got temporary tax cuts. You spend the money, somebody has to pay for it. It doesn't really matter what the taxes are. The way in which you tax matters, but the fact that you spent the money means you are going to get the taxes. Republicans can buy votes with tax cuts, but they're not cutting taxes if they're not cutting spending. It's the only thing that matters. And the third thing I would say is twice we've had third-party candidates, Ross Perot and Donald Trump, and they both have the same theme: shut down pet trade. So be very careful about your third-party candidate, because you think the smart guy's coming along. I don't think so, okay? The dumb guy's coming along. And I said to Mitt once, hey, Mitt, you ought to run for president. You hate Trump. You might be able to defeat him. You might, because Mitt was my partner at Bain. If you ran in Utah and you ran in Idaho, where there's a lot of Mormons, and this is way back when Mitt was electable, I said you might be able to get this thrown into the House, and then Republicans are in the House. And he said, throw it into the House. Those people are more radical than the people you hear on TV, who are more radical than the voters. He's like, the last place you would want the presidential candidacy thrown is into the House. I mean, he almost lit his hair on fire when I said it. So be very careful what you wish for. The moderate candidate who's going to come in and get serious, I want to believe it's true. And Jason and I will run. He can be the president, and I'll be his vice president. Okay, but it ain't happening. That's not who the third parties are. Okay, the third parties are kooks.
Well, thanks so much, Professor.